Chapter 2: Emotional Challenges of Long-Term Migration. Although in many cases migration can be a solution rather than a problem, it is never an easy process. Everything changes at once in the life of the person who emigrates, and the further away they go, the greater the change. It is not only friends and family that are left behind, but also the landscape, the smells, the language, the customs. And, as a consequence, migration transforms one's own identity. Long-term migrants face a number of significant emotional challenges when settling in a new country. Emotional management in this context is crucial for their well-being and adaptation, as the migration process involves a number of changes and challenges that can profoundly affect their mental health. One of the main emotional challenges is mourning the loss of familiarity and sense of belonging. In leaving behind their country of origin, migrants are not only separated from family and friends, but also from the culture, language, and environment they are familiar with. This sense of loss can be intense and provoke feelings of nostalgia and sadness. Homesickness is a common phenomenon and can be a persistent experience that affects mood and motivation. In addition, migrants often experience culture shock when confronted with new social norms, values, and practices. This culture shock can lead to feelings of confusion, frustration, and isolation, as the customs and way of life in the host country may be very different from what they are used to. The language barrier can also exacerbate this feeling of isolation, making communication and social integration difficult. Uncertainty about the future is another significant emotional challenge. Many migrants face precarious situations in terms of employment, housing, and legal status, which can generate anxiety and stress. Constant worry about the future and the safety of loved ones, especially if they have family in the country of origin or in other parts of the world, adds a considerable emotional burden. To manage these emotional challenges, long-term migrants often resort to a number of natural coping mechanisms. One of the most common is the building of support networks within communities of migrants or people who share a similar experience. These networks can provide a sense of belonging and emotional support, as well as being a source of information and practical resources. Cultural expression is another important means of emotional management. Through music, food, art, and other cultural practices, migrants can maintain a link to their cultural identity and heritage, providing comfort and a sense of continuity in a new and often strange environment. Developing new routines and participating in local activities can also be beneficial. Getting involved in the local community, whether through work, education, or recreational activities, helps migrants build new connections and find a place in their new environment. Finally, access to psychological support services is essential for many migrants, especially those who have experienced significant trauma or hardship. Counseling and therapy can offer a safe space to process complex emotions and develop effective coping strategies. In summary, long-term migrants face a range of emotional challenges related to loss, culture shock, and uncertainty. Emotional management and coping mechanisms, such as community support, cultural expression, and access to mental health services, are critical to help them navigate these challenges and find emotional balance in their new life. There are numerous case studies that illustrate the emotional challenges faced by long-term migrants and how they manage these challenges. These studies offer a detailed insight into individual and collective experiences, providing a deeper understanding of the emotional dynamics involved in the migration process. Some representative examples are presented below. Case study of Syrian refugees in Germany. A study conducted by the Institute for Migration and Development Research, IMD, analyzed the emotional adjustment of Syrian refugees in Germany. Participants reported a range of emotional challenges, including conflict-related trauma, feelings of loss, and difficulty adapting to the new culture. The research showed that participation in community integration programs and access to mental health services were key to improving their emotional well-being. Programs offering psychological support, as well as cultural and educational activities, helped refugees build new social networks and manage the stress associated with their new life. Study on Mexican migrants in the United States. A study published in the Journal of Migration and Health investigated the emotional effects of migration on Mexican adults who had migrated to the United States in search of better economic opportunities. The study found that, Despite employment and economic gains, many migrants experience high levels of anxiety and depression due to social isolation and language barriers. The most effective coping mechanisms identified included participating in community support groups and connecting with organizations that offered counseling and integration assistance. Research on Ethiopian migrants in Israel, a case study conducted by Tel Aviv University, examined the emotional experiences of Ethiopian migrants in Israel. This study revealed that migrants face significant difficulties related to culture shock and discrimination. They often felt caught between two cultures and experienced feelings of alienation. The research highlighted the importance of integration programs that include language classes, psychological support, and cultural integration activities to help these migrants adapt and develop a sense of belonging in their new home. Case of international students in the UK, a study published in the International Journal of Intercultural Relations explored the emotional challenges faced by international students in the UK. The findings indicated that, in addition to academic stress, many students struggled with loneliness and feelings of disconnection. The study highlighted the importance of university support networks and student welfare services in providing an environment in which students could talk about their experiences and receive emotional support. Participation in extracurricular activities and international student groups was also identified as an effective strategy to mitigate isolation. Study on the adaptation of Vietnamese immigrants in Australia. A case study conducted by the University of Melbourne investigated the emotional adaptation of Vietnamese immigrants in Australia. The results showed that immigrants face challenges related to cultural integration and adaptation to new social norms. However, the studies also highlighted that connections with the local Vietnamese community and participation in cultural activities helped alleviate stress and strengthen a sense of identity. The study emphasized the importance of creating spaces where migrants could maintain their cultural practices while adapting to their new environment. These case studies provide valuable insights into how long-term migrants experience and manage their emotions during the adaptation process. They also highlight the importance of providing comprehensive support that addresses both the emotional and practical needs of migrants, facilitating their integration and well-being in the host country. People who have had to leave behind the world they knew in extreme situations can suffer severe emotional distress, a psychological condition suffered by millions of people around the world. Forced separation, the fear of losing one's life on the way, the struggle to eat every day, the threats of mafias, all of this today feeds the Ulysses syndrome, or chronic multiple and chronic stress syndrome. The term was coined by psychiatrist Joseba Akotegi, and his work at the Psychopathological and Psychosocial Care Service for Immigrants and Refugees, SAPAIA, has also allowed him to learn about its evolution. The Ulysses syndrome is the syndrome of the migrant with chronic and multiple stress. In other words, it is when the problems experienced by the migrant are many and multiply and have a long duration. As Dr. Akotegui explains, when the conditions are so difficult that there is no possibility of overcoming them, and the person enters a situation of permanent crisis, this is when we speak of the Ulysses syndrome. Dr. Joseba Achotegui, 2014. Migrants live a very particular reality, and their problems are not similar to the problems of other people who have never left their place of origin. This is why the issue of migrant mental health must be approached from a different point of view. For Joseba Achotegui, putting a name to what these men and women suffer has an objective that goes beyond the academic. Talking about Ulysses syndrome makes visible a terrible reality in which thousands of migrants live all over the world and contributes to raising awareness of the existence of a specific problem. It is one more step on the road to humanizing healthcare and reminding us of the need to pay attention to the emotions and experiences of those who find themselves in a situation of distress. Giving a name to what is happening to these men and women can help health services to stop trivializing the problem. They do not suffer from a mental disorder, but they do suffer from severe stress. Defining it can prevent someone saying that there is nothing wrong with someone who suffers so terribly, or that these patients are misdiagnosed as depressive. Because they are not suicidal, they are struggling to live, they are proactive, and try to keep hope. But enduring such intense stress for so long has cerebral, hormonal, muscular consequences. and it is common for them to suffer from insomnia, migraines, anxiety, sadness, and a wide range of symptoms. The fear that occurs in migratory mourning is related to the experience of traumatic situations, with the dangers to the physical, emotional, and psychological integrity of people who emigrate from their countries. Even so, desperation is more powerful than fear, since in their countries of origin, the situation is unsustainable for various reasons: wars, famine, undignified living conditions, persecution, etc. And these people continue to migrate. One of the factors that can be found in the Ulysses syndrome is the stress presented in the migratory process that leads to their mental health being affected. Mourning occurs to a greater or lesser extent throughout the entire migration process when the migrant is confronted with new and painful adversities. The migration process becomes a process that reaches such high levels of stress that it saturates people's capacity to cope and adapt, increasing the difficulties of mourning the migration process. All of this causes the emotional well-being of the person to drop drastically, and they go through a process of great suffering that many times the subject does not know how to handle on their own. This combination of loneliness, failure to achieve goals, experiencing extreme deprivation and terror would be the psychological and psychosocial basis of the Ulysses syndrome. The most important stressors for developing this syndrome are the forced separation from loved ones, which implies a rupture of the attachment instinct, the feeling of hopelessness due to the failure of the migratory project and the absence of opportunities, the struggle for survival, where to eat, where to find a roof to sleep under, and the fear, the terror experienced on migratory journeys, small boats, hiding in trucks, endless walks, crossing dangerous areas, etc., the threats of mafias, the lack of a safe place to sleep, etc., detention and expulsion, or the defenselessness of having no rights. This series of situations that migrants have to go through can have an impact on their psychological well-being, which can last for months or even years. Psychologically speaking, migration is an event that entails a huge change for the person and that disrupts them on many levels and can leave deep emotional wounds. The change is a stress or bereavement for the person. Ulysses syndrome is a real challenge for the current healthcare system. It calls for a comprehensive assessment of the complicated situation of migrants suffering from this borderline stress syndrome. The Ulysses syndrome is not a disease. It is a reactive picture of stress in situations of extreme migratory bereavement that cannot be dealt with, due to the characteristics already discussed. However, it could be the basis for the development of serious mental illnesses. In short, these are healthy people, without a history of mental disorders, who acquire temporarily variable symptomatology, such as insomnia, loneliness, fear, and lack of opportunities. When the above-mentioned factors disappear, they can return to their original state of health. Therefore, this syndrome is situated in the area of health and psychosocial prevention. Garcia, 2013. This issue, therefore, requires adequate prevention of the disorder at various levels, and we cannot focus on a single individual level, just as attention is required at a general community level. In fact, according to Achotegui, 2017, the Ulysses syndrome is more specifically found in the field of health and psychosocial prevention than in the field of treatment itself. Intervention should focus basically on psychoeducation and therapy that guarantees emotional containment, so that work on the syndrome does not only involve psychologists, doctors, or psychiatrists, but also social workers, nurses, social educators, and other care professionals. Only in this way, the migrant will not perceive discrimination and feel isolated. His or her perception will be one of integration, while maintaining the link with his or her language and culture as highly powerful factors in influencing his or her general well-being. The presence of this clinical reality is a new challenge, not only in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of the fact that society, our global society, must have the necessary resources to care for this needy and large population group. The main aim is for long-term migrants to be able to successfully complete the adaptation process and their goals without compromising their health status. The various community orientation programs should be geared towards the well-being of migrants, and these programs can be highly effective as long as they are monitored regularly and fully evaluated in order to make the necessary adjustments and implement the necessary corrective measures. Ulysses syndrome is not only a health challenge, It is a complete social challenge. We present below his case study on the Ulysses syndrome. Case study, migration and mental health. The syndrome of the chronically and multiply stressed immigrant, Ulysses syndrome. Joseba Achotegui, University of Barcelona, Hospital de Sant Pere Claver, Barcelona. 1. Migration as a risk factor in mental health. Migration, like most life events, has along with a number of advantages, such as access to new life opportunities and horizons, a set of difficulties. Migration would have a problematic side, a dark side, which is referred to as migration stress or migration grief. From this perspective, it is important to note that it is not appropriate to pose the equation. Migration equals migratory grief, as it would mean denying the existence of a whole series of positive aspects in migration, the existence of benefits. Migration is often more of a solution than a problem, but it is a solution with its share of problems. However, as we have pointed out, migratory mourning is a complex and, at many times, difficult mourning, especially if the personal or social circumstances of the immigrant are problematic to the point that they can even destroy the subject. We refer to migratory mourning, but it should be noted that human beings possess the capacity to migrate and to grieve. We are descended from beings who have successfully migrated many times throughout the evolutionary process, and, from this perspective, it is considered that migration is not, in itself, a cause of mental disorder, but a risk factor only if the following situations are present. If there is vulnerability, the migrant is unhealthy or disabled. If the level of stresses is very high, the host environment is hostile, if both conditions are met. In other words, migration is a risk factor if the migrant is labile, if the environment is very hostile, or if both are present at the same time, then things will become very difficult for the migrant. Second, characteristics of migration stress and grief. Migratory stress and grief have specific characteristics that differentiate them from other types of grief, mainly the death of a loved one, which we will analyze below from the perspective of their repercussions on social exclusion. Specific characteristics of migration stress and bereavement. It is a partial dual. It is a recurrent dual. It is a mourning linked to deep-rooted childhood issues. It is a multiple dual, the 7 duals of migration. It leads to changes in identity. It results in regression. It takes place in a series of phases. It involves the triggering of defense mechanisms and cognitive errors in information processing. It is accompanied by feelings of ambivalence. Migratory mourning is also experienced by the locals and by those who have remained in the country of origin. The return of the migrant is a new migration. Migratory mourning is transgenerational. Source: Achotegui, 2002. 2.1. Migratory grief is a partial grief. There is one key fact that differentiates migration grief from bereavement, the classic reference point for the concept of mourning. In the case of migration, the object, the country of origin, and any what it represents, does not disappear. It is not properly lost for the subject, for it remains where it was there, and there is a possibility of contacting it. Moreover, there is the possibility of returning one day, definitively, to the place of origin. 2.2. It is a recurrent bereavement. In the case of migration, the emotional back and forth in relation to the country of origin gives rise to recurrent processes of elaboration of the separation. Thus, it is very common to find that a trip to the country of origin, a phone call, or the information that reaches the immigrant rekindles the links with the country of origin. And we write rekindle because these links remain active throughout the subject's life, sometimes more consciously, sometimes more unconsciously. 2.3. It is a grief linked to deep-rooted childhood issues. As is well known, early childhood is a sensitive age for human beings, when a whole series of links with people close to them, language, landscape, and culture are structured. In contrast to adulthood, childhood is not only a time when we experience the events in which we are immersed, but also when these events condition the way in which we build our personality. They form part, so to speak, of the materials with which we build the edifice of our personality. Childhood shapes us. In adulthood, the structure of the personality is already formed, and the events we experience act on something already built, which can only be modified in part. Therefore, when a person emigrates, he or she is already conditioned by what he or she has experienced in childhood. and logically will have difficulty adapting fully to the new situation. 2.4. Migratory grief is a multiple grief. We will see below that, in addition to all of the above, migratory mourning is a mourning for many things. It is a multiple grief. Possibly, no other situation in a person's life, even the loss of a loved one, entails as many changes as migration. Everything around the person changes, all the more so, the more distant and culturally distant the migration is. As we pointed out in a previous text, Akotegui, 1999, we consider that there are at least 7 mourning events in migration: family and friends, the language, culture, customs, religion, values, the land, landscape, colors, smells, luminosity, social status, roles, jobs, housing, possibilities for social advancement, contact with the ethnic group, prejudice, xenophobia, racism, risks to physical integrity, dangerous journeys, risk of expulsion, defenselessness. 2.5. Migratory grief affects identity. As could not be otherwise, the multiplicity of aspects involved in the elaboration of migratory mourning, family, language, culture, or status, among others, gives rise to profound changes in the immigrant's personality to such an extent that they modify his or her own identity. In other words, for better or worse, migration changes the subject. If it goes well, it will favor the emergence of a mature, worldly person. If it goes badly, it will destroy the subject on a psychosocial and psychological level. We understand identity as the set of self-representations that allow the subject to feel, on the one hand, as similar and belonging to certain communities that share certain values or ideas, and on the other hand, different and not belonging to others. Akotegui, 2002. 2.6. Migratory grief leads to psychological regression. Faced with so many changes at once, the migrant often tends to feel overwhelmed and insecure, and to adopt regressive attitudes. From a psychological perspective, the concept of regression is understood as the regression of the person towards more childish, less autonomous attitudes. The 3 most basic expressions of this infantile regression in migration would be dependency behaviors. The migrant tends to behave in a submissive manner towards authority figures. He or she acts like a child towards parental figures. The infantile complaint, the tantrum, another typically regressive attitude in the face of frustration and pain, is the protest, the tantrum. The overvaluation of leaders. As social psychology points out, when there is a situation of danger, human beings tend to act with a tendency towards hierarchization.